The millionaire forced his daughter to marry a beggar to humiliate her. On the wedding day, everyone was terrified by the secret the beggar revealed. The grand mansion perched on the hill glimmered under the morning sun, a testament to wealth and status. Inside, amidst the pristine halls and gold-edged mirrors, a storm brewed in the mind of its owner, William Carrington, a self-made millionaire with an iron fist. To the world, he was a symbol of success and affluence. To his daughter Evelyn, he was a man consumed by pride and control. Evelyn, on the other hand, was the embodiment of warmth and compassion. She spent her mornings at the local shelters and afternoons teaching underprivileged children to read. Her weekends were dedicated to distributing food in the city's impoverished neighborhoods. To her father, these were acts of defiance, a rejection of the high society he had painstakingly climbed into. Evelyn, he would say, voice sharp with disdain, "We are Carringtons. Our place is not with beggars." But Evelyn would only smile, her resolve unshaken. "Father, their worth isn't in their wealth but in their hearts." This battle of ideologies had brewed for years. While William saw his daughter's actions as a threat to his carefully curated image, Evelyn remained steadfast, driven by a conviction that every soul deserved dignity. The more she gave, the more her father's fury grew, a volcano on the verge of eruption. In the bustling streets below the Carrington mansion, life was a world apart. Children played with makeshift toys, and the aroma of street food mingled with the occasional whiff of garbage. Among them lived a man few noticed, a beggar named Daniel. He was gaunt and weathered, his clothes tattered, yet there was an inexplicable dignity in his eyes. When passers-by dropped coins, he would thank them with a nod, often using what little he had to share bread with the street children who called him Uncle Da. Daniel's nights were plagued with dreams, or perhaps memories, flashes of grand halls, laughter, and a melody he couldn't place. Waking, he dismissed them as tricks of a weary mind. Yet, deep down, he carried a sense of belonging to a world far removed from the streets he now called home. Daniel woke every morning to the hum of city life, sprawled on the cold pavement outside a bakery that tossed its unsold bread into the trash each night. He was not like the other beggars who cursed the heavens or begged relentlessly. Daniel worked quietly, offering to sweep shop fronts or carry heavy loads in exchange for a meal. If he earned enough, he'd spend it on the street children who flocked to him, their laughter and innocence a rare solace. Despite his ragged appearance, Daniel held himself with a quiet pride. Shopkeepers spoke of his kindness. He had once spent an entire winter's night sharing his blanket with a stray dog. When a fruit vendor's cart toppled, scattering apples across the busy street, it was Daniel who had scrambled to save them, brushing off any reward. But Daniel's kindness masked a deep, gnawing pain. At night, when the streets emptied and silence fell, he wrestled with questions he couldn't answer. Why did certain scents, a whiff of lavender soap, the tang of polished wood, send jolts of familiarity through him? Why did snippets of music, the faintest strains of a piano, bring tears to his eyes? The fragments of a past life teased him relentlessly, like the edges of a puzzle missing its center. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of amber and rose, Daniel sat on the pavement, playing a makeshift flute. The melody, haunting and beautiful, stopped passers-by in their tracks. Among them was Evelyn Carrington, on her way home from a long day of volunteering. She paused, captivated by the music. When the last note lingered in the air, Evelyn approached him. "That was beautiful," she said softly, slipping a wrapped sandwich into his hands. Daniel hesitated before accepting, his voice low but steady. "Thank you, miss. Kindness is a rare gift." Evelyn stayed a moment longer, her gaze meeting his. There was something in his eyes, wisdom, pain, and an unyielding strength that struck her. Little did she know, this fleeting encounter would become the thread tying their fates together. The confrontation was inevitable. William Carrington's patience had worn thin, eroded by whispers from his circle of high society friends who had caught sight of Evelyn handing out blankets to homeless families. "She's ruining the Carrington name," one murmured at a gala. Such behavior invites scandal. William seethed as the comments piled up, each one an affront to the empire he had built. He summoned Evelyn to his study, a room lined with leather-bound books and the lingering scent of cigars, a chamber of authority and judgment. "You will stop this nonsense at once," he said, his voice sharp as a blade. Evelyn stood her ground, her chin held high. "Helping others is not nonsense, father. It's what makes life meaningful." His fist slammed onto the oak desk. "Meaningful? Do you think I built all this to watch you squander it on beggars and outcasts? You are a Carrington, Evelyn. Our name commands respect, not pity." Her defiance was a spark against his tinder-dry temper. "If our name only commands respect through wealth and power, then it's a name I'm not proud to bear." William's face darkened, his fury shifting into something colder, more calculating. He had tolerated her rebellion for too long. Now he would teach her a lesson she would never forget, a lesson that would remind her who held the reins. It was during one of his solitary brooding sessions that William's gaze wandered to the window. From his mansion, he could see the distant streets below, bustling with the city's chaos. Among the figures moving through the crowd, a lone man caught his attention, a beggar with a calm, composed demeanor that set him apart. An idea began to take root in William's mind, sinister in its brilliance. If Evelyn insisted on associating with the downtrodden, he would grant her wish, but on his terms. His plan was cruel and calculated. He would force his daughter to marry this beggar, a man from the very streets she idolized. It would be the ultimate humiliation, stripping her of her pride and demonstrating the futility of her charitable ideals. As the thought crystallized, William's lips curled into a cold smile. "Let's see how much kindness she has left after this." William Carrington wasted no time. His plan was as cruel as it was methodical. He called his assistant, a shrewd man named Harris, into his study. "Harris," William began, his tone cold and deliberate, "I need you to find out everything about that beggar near the old market. The one who's always playing that infernal flute. I want to know his name, his habits, everything." Harris raised an eyebrow but dared not question his employer. Within 2 days, he returned with a detailed report. The beggar's name was Daniel. He had no known family, no formal education, and no criminal record. A drifter with no ties to the world. Perfect for William's purposes. "Good," William said, setting the report aside. "Now bring him to me. Make him an offer he can't refuse." Meanwhile, William began crafting the narrative he would present to Evelyn. To ensure she complied, he would threaten to cut her off financially, a tactic he had used before. But this time he would take it further, implying that her continued rebellion could ruin the lives of those she sought to help. If she truly cared about her precious charities, she would have no choice but to obey. In the shadows of the Carrington mansion's grandeur, the staff whispered of their employer's temper and cruelty. Few knew the specifics of his latest scheme, but they had seen the dark gleam in his eyes and heard the sharp bark of orders to Harris. Whatever he was planning, it boded ill for Evelyn. For his part, William justified his actions with a twisted logic. "She needs to learn," he muttered to himself as he stared out over the city. "This isn't punishment, it's protection. If she continues down this path, she'll destroy herself and the Carrington legacy." In the quiet of his study, William poured himself a glass of scotch and savored the imagined scene. Evelyn's proud head bowed in shame, the beggar fumbling awkwardly in the company of high society, and the whispers of gossip that would echo through the halls of power. It was, he thought with satisfaction, a perfect plan. Harris found Daniel sitting in his usual spot near the old market, his flute resting in his lap as children gathered around him. Daniel's music had become a small beacon of joy in an otherwise harsh world. Harris watched for a moment, noting the beggar's composed demeanor and the subtle respect he commanded among the street dwellers. He approached cautiously, his polished shoes clicking against the uneven pavement. "You're Daniel, correct?" Harris said, his voice clipped but neutral. Daniel looked up, his expression wary. "That's me." "Who's asking?" My name is Harris. I work for Mr. William Carrington. At the mention of the name, a few onlookers stirred, recognizing the powerful man's reputation. He has a proposition for you. Daniel's brows furrowed. I'm not interested in charity. This isn't charity, Harris replied, his tone firm. It's an opportunity, a chance to change your life. Harris's words piqued Daniel's curiosity, but his instincts urged caution. Still, he followed Harris, intrigued by what a man like William Carrington could want from someone like him. Inside the mansion's opulent study, Daniel sat stiffly in a chair that seemed too fine for him. Across the desk, William Carrington regarded him with a mixture of disdain and calculation. You must be wondering why you're here, William began, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. I've observed you. You're a man of peculiar integrity for your circumstances. Daniel said nothing, his jaw tightening. William leaned forward, his tone taking on a sharper edge. I need you to marry my daughter. The words hung in the air, absurd and shocking. Daniel blinked, certain he had misheard. You want me to what? Marry my daughter, Evelyn, William repeated. It will be a mutually beneficial arrangement. I'll provide you with enough money to ensure you'll never have to live on the streets again. In return, you'll help me teach her a lesson. Daniel's expression hardened. A lesson? She's your daughter, not a pawn. William smirked. Everyone's a pawn, Daniel. It's only a matter of whose board they're on. Think of it this way. The money could help a lot of those children you care so much about. The mention of the children struck a chord, and Daniel's resolve faltered. After a long, tense silence, he nodded reluctantly. I'll do it. But only because I can turn this into something good. William's smile widened. Wise choice. Evelyn was in the garden when her father summoned her. The meticulously manicured lawns, dotted with bursts of color from her favorite roses, had always been her refuge. But today, even the beauty of the flowers couldn't settle the unease that gripped her as she walked into his study. William was waiting, seated in his high-backed chair with a smug expression that sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. She knew that look. It meant he had orchestrated something, and she would be the pawn. Sit, he commanded. Evelyn complied, folding her hands tightly in her lap. What is it, father? I've made arrangements for your marriage, William announced, his tone devoid of emotion, as if discussing a business merger. You'll be wed in 2 weeks. Her heart stopped for a beat before racing wildly. Marriage? To whom? William's smirk deepened. To a man who will suit your charitable inclinations. A beggar from the streets. Evelyn stared at him, disbelief etched across her face. You can't be serious. Oh, but I am, he said, leaning back in his chair. You want to spend your life among the downtrodden. Fine. Let's see how you fare as one of them. Fury and heartbreak collided within her. You're doing this to punish me, to humiliate me. I'm doing this to teach you a lesson, William snapped, his voice rising. You've disrespected me, Evelyn, time and again. You think the world is all rainbows and kindness, but it isn't. Marrying him will show you the reality you so stubbornly romanticize. Evelyn rose to her feet, trembling. I won't do it. You will, William said coldly. Because if you refuse, I'll cut off every penny. And I'll ensure that no charity in this city receives a cent from the Carrington name ever again. Think of all those people you care so much about. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She knew he meant it. Her father's cruelty had no limits when his pride was at stake. After a long, agonizing silence, she whispered, Fine. I'll do it. William's victory felt hollow, but he dismissed the pang of guilt as weakness. Good. The arrangements are already underway. Evelyn left the study, her heart heavy with anger and sorrow. This was no longer just a battle with her father. It was a test of her resilience and integrity. The Carrington estate buzzed with activity in the days leading up to the wedding. Servants scurried about, preparing the grand ballroom for an event that promised to be as scandalous as it was opulent. William Carrington had no intention of hiding the spectacle. Humiliation required an audience. For Daniel, the transformation began with a visit to a high-end tailor. A team of barbers and stylists scrubbed and groomed him until the man staring back in the mirror looked like a stranger. His tangled hair was trimmed into neat waves, and the stubble that had shadowed his face for years was shaved away to reveal sharp cheekbones and a strong jawline. The threadbare clothes he had worn for so long were replaced with a perfectly tailored tuxedo. Daniel studied his reflection, feeling out of place in his own skin. The transformation was only superficial. Inside, he was still the man who slept on cold pavements and shared his bread with orphans. The wealth now draped over him felt like a costume, one he was reluctant to wear. Evelyn, too, prepared for the wedding with a heavy heart. Her bridal gown, an elegant piece of ivory lace and silk, was chosen by her father's advisors, not her. She stood before the mirror in her room, staring at the woman she barely recognized. Her once bright eyes were now clouded with sorrow, her spirit weighed down by the chains of her father's will. Her maids whispered among themselves, torn between pity and curiosity. "She's marrying a beggar," one murmured. "What a disgrace." But Evelyn wasn't listening. Her thoughts were consumed by the man she had only briefly met, the beggar her father had chosen to use as a pawn. She wondered if he despised her for being part of this cruel scheme or pitied her for being trapped in it. As the days passed, Daniel and Evelyn crossed paths only briefly. Their interactions were polite but distant, both too burdened by the roles they had been forced into. Yet, beneath the surface, there was an unspoken understanding, a shared awareness that they were both victims of William Carrington's ruthless plan. On the eve of the wedding, Daniel stood on the balcony of his temporary quarters, gazing at the stars. He resolved to endure this ordeal not just for himself, but for Evelyn and the lives they might change together. As the wedding preparations reached their crescendo, the atmosphere in the Carrington mansion became electric with tension. The house was filled with the sounds of clinking glasses, florists arranging towering bouquets, and musicians rehearsing for the grand ceremony. Guests whispered behind their hands, exchanging salacious rumors about the wedding that had already become the talk of high society. For Daniel, the mansion itself was a strange and unsettling place. Every corner seemed to tug at the edges of his fragmented memories. As he walked through the marble-floored halls, something about the rich scent of polished wood and the ornate chandeliers felt hauntingly familiar. One afternoon, while wandering aimlessly to escape the stares of disdainful staff, Daniel found himself in a grand library. His gaze landed on a portrait above the fireplace, a painting of a woman with kind eyes and an elegant smile. The sight sent a shiver through him. He couldn't explain why, but something about her face struck him with a pang of longing and recognition. "That's my grandmother," Evelyn's voice cut through his thoughts, startling him. She stood in the doorway, her expression guarded. Daniel turned, his brow furrowed. "She seems familiar. I'm not sure why." Evelyn looked at him curiously, but the moment was fleeting. She wasn't ready to trust him, not when he was part of her father's scheme. She left without another word, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. The fragments of his past felt closer than ever, just out of reach, but tangible enough to unsettle him. Meanwhile, William Carrington observed everything with a calculating eye. He had noticed Daniel's unease, though he dismissed it as nerves. His plan was progressing perfectly, and the idea that the beggar might have a deeper connection to his world never crossed his mind. The tension between Daniel and Evelyn began to shift as well. During quiet moments, they exchanged small but significant words. She began to see that Daniel wasn't the opportunist her father had painted him to be. His calm dignity and genuine kindness were impossible to ignore. Despite the growing unease in the mansion, the wedding day loomed closer. Both Daniel and Evelyn could feel it. Something was simmering beneath the surface, ready to erupt. It was late evening, 2 days before the wedding, when Evelyn and Daniel found themselves alone in the quiet sanctuary of the mansion's garden. The chaos of the preparations inside seemed a world away as the soft glow of lanterns illuminated the winding paths and blooming flowers. Evelyn sat on a stone bench, staring into the reflection of the moon in the garden pond. Her thoughts churned with anger and sadness, but above all, exhaustion. Daniel approached cautiously, sensing her need for space but unable to ignore the pull to speak. "May I join you?" he asked gently. She glanced up, surprised by the courtesy in his tone. After a moment she nodded. He sat at the far end of the bench, keeping a respectful distance. For a while they sat in silence, the hum of crickets filling the air. Finally Evelyn spoke. "You must hate me for all this." Daniel shook his head. "Hate you? Well, I don't blame you for your father's actions. You're as much a victim as I am." His words took her by surprise. She turned to face him, studying his profile. In his calm expression, she saw not bitterness but resilience. "Why did you agree to this?" she asked softly. "Why go along with his plan?" Daniel hesitated, then answered honestly. "At first I thought it was for the money. I told myself I could use it to help the children on the streets, to make their lives a little better. But now," he paused, searching for the right words. "Now I think I agreed because I saw something in you, something good. And I didn't want to see that destroyed by him." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She had expected resentment or self-interest, but instead she found sincerity. "I didn't ask for any of this," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that kindness can survive even the worst circumstances." They sat together for hours, their conversation flowing with an honesty that surprised them both. For the first time, Evelyn saw Daniel not as a beggar but as a man of strength and integrity. And for Daniel, Evelyn became more than her father's pawn. She was a kindred spirit in a battle neither of them had chosen. The day of the wedding dawned with a heavy stillness that seemed to settle over the Carrington mansion. The grand ballroom was decorated to perfection, with cascading floral arrangements, crystal chandeliers shimmering like frozen rain, and rows of gilded chairs occupied by high society guests. Every detail screamed opulence, but the atmosphere buzzed with curiosity and judgment rather than joy. Evelyn stood in her bridal suite, staring at her reflection. The gown was breathtaking, a masterpiece of lace and silk, but she felt like a prisoner dressed for display. Her heart was heavy, but she steeled herself. If nothing else, she would face this ordeal with dignity. Meanwhile, Daniel stood in a small room near the ballroom, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He looked every bit the part of a groom, yet he felt out of place, an actor in someone else's cruel play. His mind was a storm of fragmented memories and unease. Every step he took within the mansion seemed to bring him closer to some truth he couldn't yet grasp. The guests, a parade of designer gowns and expensive suits, whispered behind their champagne glasses as they waited for the ceremony to begin. "Have you ever heard of such a thing?" one socialite said, her voice dripping with disdain. "A beggar marrying into the Carrington family. It's disgraceful," another replied. But then, William Carrington always did have a flair for theatrics. When the music began, the room fell silent. Evelyn entered, her head held high despite the shame burning in her chest. Whispers rippled through the crowd as she walked down the aisle, her beauty undeniable but overshadowed by the scandal of the occasion. Daniel waited at the altar, his hands clenched at his sides. When their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them, a shared resolve to endure this moment together. The officiant began the ceremony, his voice formal and detached. As he spoke, Daniel's eyes wandered to the audience, then to the grand hall itself. A glimmer of recognition flared in his mind. The chandeliers, the paintings, the polished wood, all of it seemed to call out to him, pulling fragmented memories into sharper focus. The vows loomed closer, and with them, the weight of everything unsaid. The officiant's voice droned on, echoing through the grand ballroom. Evelyn stood rigid, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the assembled crowd, as if dissociating from the humiliating spectacle. Daniel, however, was no longer focused on the ceremony. His eyes flitted around the room, his heart pounding as fragmented memories began to snap together like pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle. When the officiant asked Daniel to declare his vows, he hesitated. A suffocating silence fell over the room. Whispers broke out among the guests, their judgment palpable. William Carrington leaned forward in his chair, his expression sharp with irritation. "Speak your vows," the officiant prompted again, his voice firm. Daniel's hands trembled. Suddenly, he turned to face the crowd, his voice steady but filled with a tension that silenced the room. "Before I take these vows, there is something you all need to know." Evelyn's eyes snapped to him, confusion and apprehension etched across her face. William rose halfway from his seat, his jaw tightening. "What are you doing?" he hissed. Daniel ignored him. "This wedding isn't just a mockery, it's a facade," he said, his voice rising. "And the man orchestrating it, William Carrington, is not the man he claims to be." Gasps rippled through the room, but Daniel pressed on, his memories now flooding back with startling clarity. He pointed to the family portrait hanging near the altar, his voice breaking as he spoke. "That woman, your grandmother Evelyn, was my mother." The room erupted in chaos. Guests whispered, some stood, others stared in disbelief. Evelyn stumbled back a step, her face pale as the revelation crashed over her. "What nonsense is this?" William barked, his face contorted with rage. "It's not nonsense," Daniel roared, his voice shaking with a mixture of fury and pain. "Years ago you cast me out, stripped me of my name, and left me for dead. I am Daniel Carrington, your brother and Evelyn's uncle." The crowd's shock turned to horror. All eyes turned to William, who stood frozen, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. Evelyn's trembling voice broke through the uproar. "Is it true, father?" William's silence spoke louder than words. His empire of control had just collapsed under the weight of its darkest secret. The ballroom was a storm of shocked murmurs, gasps, and chaos. The guests were no longer whispering, they were openly gawking at William Carrington, the man who had just been exposed as the orchestrator of a scandalous betrayal. His carefully curated image of power and prestige shattered in an instant. Evelyn stood in the center of the storm, her hands trembling as she turned to her father. "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Is Daniel my uncle?" William's face twisted with rage and desperation. "Enough of this nonsense," he bellowed, but the quiver in his voice betrayed him. "This man is delusional, a liar trying to ruin my reputation." But Daniel's composure didn't waver. He stepped closer to the crowd, addressing them directly. "You want proof? Look at me. Look at the family portrait. Look at the resemblance, the features you all ignored because I was cast down to the streets." He turned to Evelyn. "You're the only one who ever saw me as human, Evelyn. Even without knowing who I was, you treated me with kindness." Evelyn's eyes glistened with tears as she began to see the truth in his words. The ache in his voice, the haunted look in his eyes. It was undeniable. She turned back to William, her voice trembling but resolute. "Why did you do it, father? Why would you cast out your own brother?" William's veneer of authority crumbled as his secrets came rushing back. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time in years, he looked defeated. He was weak, William spat, though his voice lacked conviction. He would have ruined the family with his idealism, his naive generosity. "I had to protect what I built." Daniel's laugh was bitter. "Protect? You destroyed a family for the sake of your ego. You left me to rot on the streets while you basked in wealth and power." The room erupted again, but this time the whispers were different. Words like disgrace, betrayal, and monster floated through the air. William's empire wasn't just crumbling, it was imploding under the weight of public scorn. Evelyn took a deep breath, stepping between her father and Daniel. "This ends now," she said, her voice steady. "Your cruelty stops here." The fallout from Daniel's revelation was swift and merciless. The guests, who had once eagerly vied for William Carrington's favor, now recoiled from him like he carried a contagion. Whispers of disdain and disgust filled the room as the reality of his betrayal sank in. "This is unforgivable," one guest muttered. "How could he do that to his own brother?" another hissed, clutching her pearls. William tried to regain control, his voice booming over the murmurs. "You don't understand," he shouted. "I did what I had to for the sake of the family." But his excuses fell on deaf ears. Even those closest to him, business partners, allies, old friends, turned away, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. The press, which had already been alerted to the peculiar circumstances of the wedding, caught wind of the drama almost immediately. By the next morning, headlines screamed of William Carrington's treachery, the cruel king of high society unmasked, and Carrington empire crumbles under family betrayal. With the revelation spreading like wildfire, legal repercussions followed. Daniel's reappearance as a Carrington heir reopened old financial disputes. Lawyers descended like vultures, combing through records and challenging William's legitimacy as the sole head of the family fortune. Skeletons long buried in William's closet were dragged into the light, leaving his reputation in ruins. Evelyn, meanwhile, withdrew from her father entirely. She refused to hear his justifications or accept his pleas for reconciliation. Her focus shifted to Daniel, who, despite the turmoil, remained grounded, refusing to let the events shake his resolve. Stripped of allies, reputation, and respect, William was left isolated in his mansion, a kingdom turned to dust. Servants resigned en masse, unwilling to stay loyal to a man so devoid of humanity. The opulent halls grew eerily quiet, and the once bustling estate became a shadow of its former self. For the first time in decades, William Carrington was truly alone. Yet, in his isolation, he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions, the brother he had betrayed, the daughter he had alienated, and the legacy he had destroyed. The man who had built his empire with an iron fist now sat in silence, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like an iron chain. Evelyn stepped out of her father's shadow as though emerging from a cage into the light for the first time. The scandal that had rocked the Carrington family did not destroy her. It freed her. No longer bound by the expectations of a controlling parent, she began to chart her own path. In the days following the revelation, Evelyn stayed by Daniel's side. They spent hours talking, unraveling the truth of his past and the ways her father had wronged him. What struck her most was Daniel's resilience. Despite years of suffering, he harbored no bitterness, only a quiet determination to do better for others. The press clamored for Evelyn's perspective on the fallout, but she refused interviews and public statements. Instead, she focused on the work that had always been her passion, helping the less fortunate. With her father's control over the family fortune in jeopardy, Evelyn made bold moves to ensure her resources went to causes she believed in. She liquidated her personal assets and began funding local shelters, educational programs, and outreach initiatives. Her name became synonymous not with scandal but with compassion. Where her father's reputation fell, hers rose, a beacon of hope to those who had been ignored or cast aside. Daniel, too, became part of Evelyn's new chapter. Though the legality of his place in the Carrington lineage remained uncertain, Evelyn didn't care. To her, Daniel wasn't defined by wealth or status but by his character and integrity. Together, they visited the streets where he had once lived, listening to the stories of those still struggling and pledging to make a difference. When Evelyn returned to the mansion to collect her belongings, she found her father in his study, looking smaller and more frail than she had ever seen him. He tried to speak, to offer apologies laced with excuses, but she silenced him with a raised hand. "I hope you find peace someday," she said, her voice steady but distant. "But I can't carry the weight of your choices anymore." With that, she left the house that had once been her prison, stepping into a life of her own design. For the first time, Evelyn felt truly free. The weeks after the wedding became a period of quiet rebuilding for both Evelyn and Daniel. What had begun as a cruel, forced union had transformed into an unexpected partnership, forged through shared experiences and mutual respect. Evelyn no longer saw Daniel as a beggar or even as a victim of her father's schemes. She saw the man he truly was, kind, principled, and wise beyond his years. In him, she found an anchor amidst the chaos. Likewise, Daniel saw in Evelyn a steadfast spirit, someone willing to stand against cruelty and fight for what she believed was right. They were two souls shaped by adversity, drawn together not by circumstance but by choice. Their relationship grew slowly and naturally, with none of the pretenses that had surrounded their arranged marriage. They spent hours walking through the neighborhoods Evelyn loved, talking to those in need and discussing how they could help. Daniel often shared stories of his time on the streets, both the struggles and the small moments of hope that had kept him going. Evelyn listened intently, her admiration for him growing with each passing day. In turn, she confided in him about the pain of living under her father's control and the fear she had carried for so long. One afternoon, while they worked together at a local shelter, Daniel paused to watch Evelyn laughing with a group of children. The light in her eyes, the warmth in her smile, it was a sight that filled him with gratitude. She had chosen to stand by him, not because of his newfound identity as a Carrington but because of the person he was. Later that evening, as they sat by the fireplace in their modest new home, Daniel spoke the words that had been weighing on his heart. "Evelyn," he said softly, "what your father meant for cruelty turned into something I never expected. You've given me more than a name or a place to belong. You've given me hope." She turned to him, her eyes shimmering. "You've done the same for me." They weren't a perfect fairy tale, but they didn't need to be. Together, they began to write a story of love and purpose, one rooted in kindness and resilience. Evelyn and Daniel quickly became known as a force for good in the community. Their combined efforts transformed what had once been fleeting acts of charity into a lasting mission of hope and change. With Evelyn's organizational skills and Daniel's understanding of the struggles faced by the marginalized, they co-founded the Carrington Foundation for Humanity, an initiative dedicated to uplifting the underprivileged. The foundation began modestly, focusing on providing meals and temporary shelter. But it soon grew into a network of programs offering education, job training, and healthcare. They created safe spaces for children to learn and dream, while adults were given opportunities to rebuild their lives. Daniel's story of resilience became an inspiration, not just for those they helped but also for donors who had once dismissed him as a nobody. "Your past doesn't define your future," Daniel would say at community events. "Kindness does. Generosity does. We all have the power to lift someone up." Evelyn's decision to leave her father's wealth behind did not mean she was without influence. Her personal connections, once tied to her father's name, now worked in service of her vision. Philanthropists who admired her courage began pouring support into the foundation. At every event, Evelyn and Daniel stood together, a united front, embodying the values they preached. Their efforts extended beyond the city. They built partnerships with organizations worldwide, bringing aid to disaster-stricken areas and underserved communities. The Carrington Foundation became a beacon of hope for those who had been forgotten, and it was rooted in the very ideals William Carrington had sought to crush. The couple's relationship flourished alongside their mission. Their shared vision strengthened their bond, and their quiet evenings together became moments of reflection and gratitude. They weren't without challenges. Balancing their work and personal lives was often exhausting, but they faced every obstacle as a team. One evening, as they stood before a newly opened school funded by the foundation, Evelyn turned to Daniel. "We've done something good here," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "We have," Daniel replied, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "But this is only the beginning." Their journey, born from pain and cruelty, had transformed into a legacy of compassion and hope, a testament to the power of rising above adversity. While Evelyn and Daniel focused on building their future, the shadow of William Carrington lingered. The once powerful millionaire was now a man isolated and disgraced, living alone in the cavernous mansion that had once been a symbol of his success. The echoing halls reminded him daily of what he had lost: his wealth, his reputation, and most painfully, his family. For weeks, William avoided the newspapers, knowing they would only serve as a grim reminder of his downfall. Yet curiosity got the better of him one evening, and he found himself flipping through an article about the Carrington Foundation. A photo of Evelyn and Daniel smiling with a group of children stared back at him, their joy almost too much to bear. "She's thriving," he murmured, the words a mix of bitterness and reluctant pride. Left alone with his thoughts, William began to confront the choices that had led him to this point. His actions had been driven by a relentless hunger for control and fear of vulnerability. Casting out his brother had been his first act of cruelty, but it was far from his last. The realization that his empire had been built on a foundation of lies and manipulation gnawed at him. William's reflection in the grand mirror above the mantelpiece was unrecognizable, a man aged far beyond his years, hollow and diminished. For the first time, he wondered if redemption was possible. Could he undo the damage he had caused, or was he destined to live out his days in isolation? One morning, William made his way to the city's shelter, the very place where Daniel had once lived. He was greeted with wary glances and murmurs from those who recognized him. He found Evelyn and Daniel there, overseeing the distribution of supplies. Evelyn froze when she saw him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice cold. William hesitated, then said, "I came to apologize, to try and make amends." Daniel studied him for a long moment. "Making amends starts with action, not words." William nodded, humbled. He didn't expect forgiveness, but he knew that if he wanted it, he would have to earn it. The shelter was quiet, save for the soft murmurs of volunteers and the clatter of utensils as meals were served. William stood awkwardly in the corner, unsure of how to begin. For a man who had spent his life commanding boardrooms and dictating terms, the simple act of serving soup felt foreign and humbling. Daniel and Evelyn watched from a distance, their expressions unreadable. For hours, William ladled portions, thanked those who came by, and listened to their stories. There was no fanfare, no redemption speech, just the slow, deliberate work of a man beginning to confront his past. When the day ended, William approached Daniel and Evelyn, his shoulders hunched in a way that made him seem smaller. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly, "but I want to help. If there's any way I can contribute, I want to try." Evelyn's gaze softened, though her wariness remained. "Helping others isn't about erasing guilt," she said. "It's about doing what's right because it's right. If you're here for that reason, then stay." Daniel added, his voice calm but firm, "Kindness isn't transactional. If you're willing to put in the work, the rest will come in time." William nodded, grateful for the chance to start anew, even if it would be a long road. In the months that followed, the Carrington Foundation flourished, its mission strengthened by the unexpected alliance between the estranged family members. William used his remaining resources and connections to amplify their efforts, though he never again sought to control the work. Slowly, his relationship with Evelyn and Daniel began to mend, built not on wealth or power, but on mutual respect and understanding. The story of the Carrington family became a testament to transformation. What had started as a tale of cruelty and manipulation turned into one of redemption and resilience. Daniel's journey from beggar to builder of hope inspired many, while Evelyn's courage to stand against her father became a rallying cry for those seeking to reclaim their lives. In the end, the lesson was clear. Adversity, when met with kindness and resolve, could forge a brighter future. As Evelyn and Daniel looked out over the Foundation's latest project, a school for underprivileged children, they held hands, their hearts full of gratitude for the lives they had rebuilt together.